There we are. Hey everyone, how you all doing today? Josh Knoll with Gulf Coast Financial Advisors. I'm joined once again by Matthew Eichmann. He is the National Retirement Practice Leader for Qualified Plan Advisors. Matthew, how are you doing?
I'm good. Josh, how you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. I don't know what the temperature is where you're at, and don't mean to timestamp this, but it is blazing hot down here today. So as soon as this video is over, this jacket is coming off.
Good. Well, looks like it'll join your hair then.
Yes.
A fair amount of that since we talked last time too.
Yeah, those of you all that have been joining us on in our efforts here will notice that my wife finally got the best of me, and all the hair came off. I think I lost about 10 pounds in one sitting. So thank you for noticing that.
Mine's getting a little shaggy now too. I'm sure.
Oh, you're looking good. Let it go.
I'm sure people can tell that I've really grown mine out since last time. So we're headed in opposite directions apparently.
Well, Matthew, today I warned you before we went on video. I gave you a nerd alert. We're talking about what is really probably one of my more enjoyable topics in the 401k space, and that's benchmarking. And I think part of that is, anybody that's followed my marketing over the last couple of years realizes that I enjoy taking things apart, seeing how they work, see if we can put them back together in a more effective way. And really, that's kind of a properly structured benchmarking exercise may possibly give you that opportunity. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I know we're not just going to talk about benchmarking in a cliche way, hey, you should benchmark your plan. It's the right thing to do. We're going to really talk about, how do you do it? Why do you do it? And what does it involve? So without further ado, I'm going to let you take the table on that.
Great. And I love what you said about kind of taking it apart, figuring out how it works, and then trying to put it back together. When I think about benchmarking, and how we should talk about it with people, we probably ought to do that as well. We probably ought to take apart the entire exercise, figure out what the ingredients are of a good benchmarking attitude and a benchmarking process, and then we'll put it all back together at the end. So, you already gave us a bit of a glimpse into those three core areas, which is, why do we do it? And then how do we do it? And then what do we benchmark when we benchmark? And so we want to talk about those three areas, and then we want to sandwich that in between a couple of broader statements about really the philosophy and the attitude that people ought to have when they benchmark. And so I think we want to start there, Josh, and then we'll go through the why and the how and the what, and then let's end there as well, because more than anything, we want people to come away from this talk thinking, wow, I really ought to do that, and it's not as bad as I thought it might be. So that's all right with you. I think we kind of start down that road.
I absolutely agree. I think that the folks that have been paying attention to the content we've been putting out have some familiarity with benchmarking. Maybe have even gone through it at some point in their time as a plan sponsor. But I think also a lot of times they're thinking, well, I know what it is. I know I keep getting told I should do it, but why? Why should I benchmark? So if you don't mind, Matthew, I'd like to start there.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you what's interesting about this. And I said, I want to start with a little bit of a philosophical perspective around benchmarking. So obviously, and you can see on the screen in front of us here, we want to talk about 401k plans and maybe 403b plans and other retirement plans. But let's shift gears first. Let's start in the health insurance context. Let's think a little bit about how an organization conducts its benchmarking of your health insurance. And my guess is that a lot of employers don't think of benchmarking their health insurance, but they're going out, nearly every year, maybe every other year, and pricing out the cost of health insurance. And so when we think about how that process works, do you benchmark health insurance by merely going out in the marketplace or going to your current provider and saying, hey, are we paying the national average? They say yes. You say, okay, we're good. We don't need to renegotiate premiums. Well, of course not. And when that happens, when you go through that exercise, does it happen every 5 to 10 years? And of course not, right? It happens maybe every year, maybe every other year. And then finally, when looking at the cost of health insurance, do we merely look at one number to try to figure out whether it's a good value? We really don't, right? We've got to look at not only what monthly premiums look like, but the other characteristics of what's in that health insurance program. So, what is it, a high deductible plan or a low deductible plan? And what are the out-of-pocket maximums? And what's the size of the drug network? And what's the claims experience? And is this a company that provides good customer service to people or not? So I think about that in the health insurance context. and I'll talk with people who are in a benefits position, somebody within human resources perhaps, and they'll explain to me the frequency with which they go to the market and they test out their premiums and the structure that they have for health insurance. And they say, well, tell me about your retirement plan. And they say, well, we don't look at that as often. And I guess that from my perspective, a lot of the same concerns should be prevailing in the retirement plan context as they are in the health insurance context. So I guess that's a starting point, is to encourage folks who are business owners or executives or work in HR or work in benefits to realize that the reasons that you're going through this every year on the health insurance side also apply in the retirement plan side. And in fact, because of the fiduciary aspect of it, there's actually more to lose by not doing it. So that's our starting point, Josh. I mean, I think, and I know you asked me to get into the why, and I do want to get into why, but that's really the start from a philosophical perspective. We're doing it in other places within the company's benefit structure. Why aren't we doing it there? So that's,
I think, and Matthew, sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, even further on that point, as somebody that has a life and health license, if you still had, if it was even physically possible to have the same health plan from multiple years ago, the plans have changed so much over the last especially the last 10 years, that it wouldn't even, you're not even necessarily even apples to apples in some regards on certain things.
Well, geez, you stole one of my reasons why too, Josh. So let me jump into that, and I'm going to come back to that point you made, because I like to work through the reasons why in kind of a 4-step process. And the reason that I think about it in this way is that I don't know every individual person who's listening to us. I don't know what the specific role is of everybody, and I also don't know what your priorities are. So if we walk through these 4 various reasons, we can see there's a little bit of something in here for everyone. So number one, the number one reason why a plan sponsor or organization would benchmark the 401k plan is because federal regulations tell us that the fees paid by a retirement plan can be no more than reasonable for necessary services. Well, how do you determine what is reasonable without some sort of benchmarking exercise? And this is really important. The regulations don't say you have to benchmark. The regulations don't say you have to do an RFP. The regulations don't say you have to do it every 1 year, every 3 years, every 5 years, every 10 years. They just tell us on an ongoing basis that the fees can be no more than reasonable. So we have that in a regulation, and some people have even heard the number 408B2. If you haven't heard it, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. But if you have heard it, that's the regulation that tells us you need to be doing this. And then secondly, and on a somewhat related note, the federal courts have looked at the fiduciary regulations, the fiduciary responsibilities under ERISA, and have told us that the federal courts expect plan fiduciaries to perform some benchmarking. If you're in an incredibly large plan, the courts will go so far as to say you need to RFP that thing, and you ought to do it about every 3 years. Now, again, there's no kind of hardline rule there, Josh. So there's not a requirement that it be an RFP or that it be done every 3 years. But we've got both regulations and federal courts telling us that some sort of reasonableness measures need to be taken. So then we get into the third reason, and this is one you just referenced. And you were thinking about kind of the health insurance context, but in the 401k and the 403b plan context, my gosh, the market has changed quickly. So that's the third reason to do it, is you'd be shocked at how much things have changed since you most recently looked at your retirement plan. In fact, rarely is this the case, but you truly can get so much more now for less than what you could have gotten 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And a lot of that comes from the fee compression that exists because the Department of Labor created a more competitive marketplace. So they have that opportunity out there. If a business owner or somebody within HR goes out and looks under the hood, I think a lot of them would be shocked at the pace of change. And then finally, the fourth one, and this is probably the farthest away from where an ERISA attorney might think when an ERISA attorney thinks about benchmarking. You do it to do right by your employees. I mean, I know a lot of employers that shop their health insurance every year, not because of a fiduciary obligation, not because some regulation says you have to do it, but when you sit around and think about your employees, you say, I want to be able to tell my employees with a straight face and in a genuine manner that I've done everything for them that I can to give them a cost competitive benefit structure. Well, that's the same when it comes to a 401k plan. And that gets lost in the shuffle because of all the focus on premiums and the rising cost of healthcare. But Josh, when you think about the pace of change and the additional resources available for people within a 401k plan, that fourth reason, which is just to do right by your people, that might be the prevailing reason within a lot of organizations. So that's kind of, you mentioned kind of pulling it apart and looking at the pieces. That why component has a little bit of something in there for everybody without regard to, their role within a company or what their priorities might be.
Well, and Matthew, along that line is with the marketplace, with doing right by your people, there has, without a doubt, there's been a lot more looking into 401k plans, qualified plans, and generally speaking, a lot of the things that have come down over the last handful of years has been for the betterment of the plan participant. When fees go down, generally speaking, the plan participant pays a little less to carry that load and they benefit a little bit. So I think that ties in with doing right by your people. There have been things that have happened, and they're not always a smooth transition. We're in this industry for many years. Sometimes it takes a while to absorb all this and move forward with it. But the reality is there's been a constant movement towards improving the situation of the plan participant. Do you agree with that? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And in fact, what's kind of interesting about that, anybody who's worked with retirement plans has seen over the last decade or so that there's significantly more transparency now. And that results in the Schedule C being attached to a Form 5500 with a lot of additional data. And then you've got those 408B2 required disclosures, and I referenced that number earlier. Or what about those quarterly statements that participants must receive? Do we really think that by disclosing all those details, employees are making significantly different decisions? I mean, absolutely not, right? It's almost too much information coming to a lot of people. But here's the residual and the key benefit from all that transparency. Because of that transparency, it's caused people like you and me, and it's caused people who work for record keepers to have a better sense for when a plan is paying too much. And so what's happened is we have this competitive atmosphere, and frankly, it's almost unnerving, Josh, because we got caught in what some refer to as this race to zero,
right?
Where fee compression pushed things down so far, we almost get to the point where we're concerned with whether there's enough value in there, right? If the fees have gotten so low that there's not good value. And we'll get to that here a little bit later, but I couldn't agree more that there are huge benefits for employees as a result of all those regulatory developments. It just happened a little less directly than what the government was probably hoping for, but it's really, really helped out employees.
All right, very good, Matthew. So I'm a plan sponsor, I'm a business owner. I've just walked through this exercise of why I should benchmark my plan. So the next thing for me would be, okay, fine, I get it. It makes sense. How do I do it?
Yeah, well, the best way to think about how to do it is probably for us to go back to that health insurance context, and let's apply some of the possible options in the retirement plan context to the health insurance context. And that's going to paint a picture for us that there's really only one way to truly do it well. So we know in the retirement plan context that you have the ability to buy a book, like the 401k Averages book, some sort of survey that goes out to the Department of Labor's website and pulls some data from Form 5500s and the attached annual report information, and then gives us some sense of what a national average might be. Okay, let's apply that in the health insurance context. If, when it comes time to look at your premiums before open enrollment, if an organization were to merely go out and try to look at some sort of incomplete data set like that without testing the market, do we really think we would find the cost savings that's available? The answer is pretty clearly no. We might find some here and there, but pretty clearly no. So that's one option. The second option, and it's a little bit better in the retirement plan context, is to use an online service that is updated a little bit more frequently and tries to gather data from multiple touch points to again figure out what's a national average and what does a range look like. But even there, if we try to apply that in the health insurance context, we'd see that that's going to be in an adequate way of really understanding what's the going market rate for my business. And that's why in the health insurance context, We go out, hire a broker goes out and shops the market, comes back with multiple bids. That's how we know what the market will bear. And on the retirement plan side, that's exactly the way to do it. Market-based due diligence, market-based benchmarking. Go out, find the companies that want to compete for your business and say to them, what will you charge me? Now, I know one thing that we hear from time to time, it's a little bit of hesitation. They say, oh, somebody's going to come in and lowball me, and then we'll move to them, and then they'll jack up the prices. Well, I'll tell you two things on that front. Number one, in, I guess, 16, 17 years in this industry, I've never seen that happen. Literally have not seen that happen when somebody survives a due diligence process that they monkey with the costs like that. Have not encountered that. Number two, even though it hasn't happened, it's really easy to work with an advisor to protect against that by negotiating a fee ceiling guarantee leading into it. So that's pretty easy to address as long as you've got an advisory firm or a consultant that understands how that could work. But kind of to tie that up in a bow and put a bow around it, I guess, Josh, the how is to reject those sorts of static and incomplete offerings like you might get from a book or some website and get out in the marketplace. I mean, frankly, think about any other aspect. I know I referenced health insurance, but think about any other aspect of how a company runs, right? If you're paying a lot for your copier services and the paper you get, do you merely kind of go out online and do a little Google search to see if you're paying the national average? Or do you talk to those salespeople who come in and figure out whether you can get a better quote? That's how it works in the retirement plan context too.
Matthew, let me say something along that line too. I think a secondary concern with that would be, I'm a plan sponsor, I'm a business owner. My cousin's brother's uncle has managed my plan for years. Don't really talk to him much, doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, but I don't necessarily want to affront them that I'm trying to look around a little bit. Is it possible when you do go to a marketplace, can that be done completely without any name on what you're trying to get, without the company name, the plan name? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. We call that blind bid. It's a blind bid process. And the appropriate way to go through that process is to provide some of the demographic data associated with the plan, like the rough total number of assets in the plan, for example, or a rough number of active participants and maybe terminated participants. And a lot of record keepers and advisors, they'll bid on that in that way, and they'll give you something that's darn near binding when they do it. So the blind bid approach is certainly the right way to do it. And let me comment on another aspect of what you brought up, and it's a little bit off of, I think, where you were leading me there. But if an organization feels that sort of loyalty to a family member, a friend of the family, get into a competitive process. And if they can win, if they can stand on their own 2 feet, hey, that's awesome. But to refuse to go through that process is essentially putting the loyalty of one relationship above the loyalty to all of those employees who show up every day and work for your organization. And when you think about it that way, and if you have a good enough relationship with your current provider to go to that family friend and say, hey, look, we love working with you. We'd like that to continue. I hope you can appreciate I've got fiduciary responsibilities under federal law. I've got courts telling me to do this. And you know what? I owe it to my people to check this out. Most of those, if they're true professionals, will say, good, can I compete? Can I be a part of that process? Let them in the process. If they can stand on their own 2 feet, then they can keep the business, and you'll know that you've not put loyalty to one person above loyalty to all those other people.
Great point. Very great point. Thank you for taking that where I was trying to go with it. All right.
Right.
So Matthew, we've discussed why we should benchmark a plan. We've discussed how, and let's say we're all in agreement now, and I've decided that we're going to do this. What am I benchmarking? What all information is needed? What pieces should be benchmarked? What's the important aspects of that?
Well, the way that retirement plans were working 10 to 15 years ago, and frankly, the way some of them still work today, even though they shouldn't, is that there's a lack of transparency and clarity around what expense goes to which organization, or what expense corresponds to which attribute or aspect of the plan. And what we know from the Department of Labor, and really this comes all the way back from the Department of Labor's perspective and the plaintiff's bar's perspective on a case involving Walmart back in about 2007 and 2008, is that the Department of Labor and the courts made it clear to us that each component of a plan structure needs to be reasonable. So for example, it's not enough to use incredibly expensive investment options that have built-in revenue sharing or kickback money that is then used to pay for record keeping and advisory expenses. That doesn't pass muster anymore. So what we know from the Department of Labor and from the courts is we need to peel apart how the plan operates, and we need to look separately at each component. So the natural starting point is to think about what's a record keeper charging? And there we really need to have some expertise to understand how to read those proposals and how to read those disclosures. Because at the end of the day, what I don't want to know is what some sort of asset charge is that the record keeper puts onto a plan, but what I want to know is what does it make? What is the revenue that goes to the record keeper from a combination of that plan level fee plus any of that money that comes back in from the investment options? So Josh, we got to look at the record keeping expense. We got to look at the advisor or the broker. If we still have a broker under some old school arrangement being paid via commissions, that money is hard to understand where that's coming from and how that's flowing. We've got to be able to benchmark that broker, that advisor. And then finally, we need to look at the cost of the investment options. But if we simply look at the cost, if all you ever look at is cost, whether it's the investment options or those other aspects of the plan, y'all know how sometimes you get what you pay for. So if it's all about just finding cheap, that's probably not the best way, particularly with your investment options, to determine whether you've got the right value there. You know, Josh, let's say, for example, that you're paying 0.5% for some sort of investment option. If I came to you and I said, hey, Josh, if you will pay 1% instead of 0.5%, you can have investment options that return 2% greater than what yours does. Now, we can't issue guarantees, and I do not mean in any way to try to do that, but I think we can all agree that if we felt that was either guaranteed or there was a high probability of it, heck, we'd jump at that. I mean, heck, if we could guarantee that, Josh, you'd probably say, hey, I'll pay an extra 0.5% if I get an extra 0.60%. We would take that. So it's going to be about the quality of the investment. So when we say what do we benchmark? We benchmark the record keeper's revenue. We benchmark the advisor or the broker's revenue. We benchmark the cost of the investment options. We benchmark the performance of the investment options compared to not just some sort of random benchmark, but their peer group. If you're using a mid-cap growth fund, how does it compare to all of the other mid-cap growth funds you could actually pick from? And then we want to roll all that up together, and we want to look at the overall value of what's being provided. And that's how we answer that what question, Josh. It's all of those items that I just worked through.
Matthew, I want to, as we're circling this back around, I want to jump back to something you said earlier related to attitude. You know, is this something that someone should do? Should there be a fear of the move? What do you think is a proper attitude once you start rolling down this benchmarking process?
Well, you know, that's a great question. And the best way to illustrate it, and I apologize in advance if some of the illustration can come off as flippant, but I think it's the best way to paint the picture. So if we talk to somebody who is kind of in charge of a retirement plan within an organization, and we say, hey, when's the last time that you benchmarked your plan? When's the last time you took it out to bid within the marketplace? And if we hear it's been a long time, then the follow-up question to that is, well, why? Why has it been so long? And it's really common to hear the answer, and it relates to what you just said, which is, well, I don't want to have to move the plan. And I listened to that for a couple of years within this industry, and I thought, well, I get it. Like, that's a lot of work. And the more I thought about it, I thought, wait a minute, why do we assume that a benchmarking exercise would result in a plan being moved? Why would we assume that it would absolutely have to move simply because we created or we fulfilled our benchmarking obligations? Then I realized, well, wait, if you go through that exercise and what you currently have is really good and the value is there, then you don't have to move it. So in fact, the only time you would move it is when you got into that process and you realized that, oh my gosh, what we have right now isn't good enough. And that completes the circle, because that tells us that's absolutely why to do it. Going back and thinking not just about, the courts and the Department of Labor telling us that you have to have reasonable expenses, but now knowing that there's been price compression, and the desire and the responsibility to do right by participants is exactly why the answer to that question should be different. Instead, it should be, well, I haven't done it in a while, but I realize that I need to. And I realize that we may not have to move the plan, but we want to go through this. And ultimately, Josh, this is kind of the big summary point when it comes to the attitude one must have, is we want to find better service or better pricing or a combination of both. And if we don't find any of that, then we can walk away feeling confident that we already have something that's best for our people. That's the right attitude to take, not the one that's afraid of the move, but the one that says, hey, if we have something really good right now, it's going to win out. And if we don't have something really good right now, that's why we've got to go through this process, because I owe it to our people to make sure we do that.
All right. So Matthew, I'm gonna throw a quote from the backwoods of the Ozarks in Missouri at you. And this is what's going to tee up us landing this. My grandpa would always say that I can tell you the cost. I can tell you the cost of everything and the value of nothing. I have to show you. That was one of his sayings. I can tell you the cost of everything and the value of nothing. I have to show you. And what he meant by is he had to show you the value. And he would do that with a variety of things, including selling pigs. So there you go. So my question to you is, someone says, okay, great, Matthew Eichmann, Josh Knoll, this sounds great. You explained why, you've explained how, you explained what's in it for you? There's a inherent, not a danger, Matthew, I want to make sure I say this properly, but just with trying to tell you the value of this thing, there's always going to be a little bit of, are we worried about something that is considered free? So how do we address that?
Well, there's probably two different ways to do that. That's a really important question. So one way that a lot of plan sponsors attack this obligation, and by the way, it's certainly not the only way, but one way is they say, hey, we think this is of value, and many things that are of value have a price tag, so we'll pay a flat fee to have a comprehensive benchmarking exercise completed for us. And we see that happen all across the country. There are services out there that will do it just for that reason. But also when you get a good advisor or an investment consulting firm in place, they kind of have the ability to, kind of peel back the onion, if you will. What I would recommend to a plan sponsor who wants to take that approach, negotiate into that a provision that says, we'll pay you X dollars to do all this work for us. But if we end up liking you through that process and we end up hiring you to work with our plan, we want to credit against our future fees equal to what we paid you. That's a great way for plan sponsors to protect themselves. And I'll just tell you, if you talk about that with an advisor and you offer that up, they're not going to tell you no. So that's a great place to start. But let's talk about the other aspect. I absolutely do not like when things of value are advertised as being free. Sounds too good to be true, right? And I've mentioned this earlier, sometimes we should realize we get what we pay for. But if somebody wants to reach out to you, Josh, for example, and ask you to perform a benchmarking exercise and they don't want to pay anything for it up front, you know what I would tell you? You're not doing it for free. You're doing it for the chance to compete. You're doing it for the chance to be able to walk in and show that value that your grandfather told you that you would need to be able to do. So you're getting an opportunity to compete, and I don't think that's free. I think that's the opportunity that you want. And so, if you and I were just talking off camera about this and you're saying, which way do I want to go on this? I'd say go either way you want. Talk to your, prospective client and say, hey, we can do it one of two ways. And in either case, recognize you're getting an opportunity and you're providing something of value, definitely providing something of value. And if all those stars align and you match up, then maybe you get a long-term relationship out of it too.
Fantastic. Matthew, that's a fantastic job. And I'd like to note here for folks that have joined us on this video, these things that we're referring to, the entire process, we can help. We have the resources, we have the team in place. These are things we can do for plans located not only in my geographic area down here along the Gulf Coast, but quite honestly, literally across the United States. So reach out to us. It's again, Josh Knoll, Gulf Coast Financial Advisors. That have been Matthew Eichmann of Qualified Plan Advisors. Matthew, I'm going to let you end this, and then I will final close it, put the bow on it with the disclosure. Before that, though, fantastic job. I was really looking forward to this, and it delivered. Great job.
Well, I know you love this area, and so my closing comment is going to be to repeat what you just said. You know, we can help, and I mean that as less of kind of a sales point and more of just a point of pride. You know, being within this industry and wanting to be able to do this work, and you know, anybody out there who's listening and who has done this knows you don't win them all when you do it. But the cool thing about a really good benchmarking exercise is even when you lose, if the client, if the plan sponsor, if the organization accomplishes, remember those goals I said earlier, better service, better pricing, or a combination of both. If you've left people in a really good situation in the course of a loss, then you still have done your job by contributing to the industry and contributing to the retirement plan system. So, I think we're here to help and would love to be a part of that. And Josh, I think you said it really well.
Yep, like my grandpa said, always leave them better than you found them.
That's great. Yeah.
All right. So, folks, advisory services offered through Prime Capital Investment Advisors, a federally registered investment advisor. PCIA doing business as Prime Capital Wealth Management and Qualified Plan Advisors. PCIA and QPA and Gulf Coast Financial Advisors are not affiliated. All information presented is for educational purposes only and is not an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Video content offers commentary and generalized research, not personalized investment advice, and is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a complete description of investment services or performance. All investments involve risk and unless otherwise stated are not guaranteed. Matthew, again, thank you very much. Folks, you've seen the banner at the bottom. You'll be able to find this video and all of our other complimentary videos related to 401k plans in a COVID world. Also, don't forget, be sure to register for our upcoming webinar on September 10th, where we bring all of this home and the 5 action items you need to consider right now this year. Matthew, thank you. Great job, and we will talk to you all again.
Thanks, Josh.